Okay, I can still see that people are joining, but for those of us that are online and already present, welcome. And welcome to the webinar today. So my name is Alison Murray, and I'm the transformation lead for the construction sector CORD, working in the client leadership focus area. So we've had a fantastic response and sign up to the Accord. So welcome to everybody that's joined us today. Just a few points of procedure. If you can keep yourself muted, I think you've already been muted as you join. There will be, the session is being recorded, so just be aware of that. So throughout the session, there will be the opportunity to ask questions using the chat function. So we'll keep an eye on that as we go through. And there'll be a section at the end which will where we'll start to look at those questions and answers. And also thank you to everybody who actually submitted some questions before the session when you registered. We'll try and answer some of those through the presentation as we go or as part of the Q&A session. Now, if we don't get a chance to answer your question or the questions which are raised either before or in the chat function today, we will make sure that we get back to you, because those chat questions are going to be recorded and saved as well. So before I move into it, I'd also want to welcome my colleagues today who are joining as panel members. So to Blake Lepper, Jonny Eames and Hannah Bryce. I'll do a bit more of a welcome to them when we get to their part in the session. So in terms of the process for today's, the running sheet for today's session, I'm going to take you through a review of the report that we undertook. So that's the purpose of the session today, is that we're going to revisit and look at the report that the Accord undertook, looking at construction contracts and special conditions which have been used by government agencies. And then we're going to hear from the panel members in terms of the impact that special conditions have for them and their part of the sector, and also their thoughts and views on the report findings. And then we'll move into a Q&A session in terms of questions that we've had and those which will come through. So I think that's probably enough of an introduction. So let's crack on to me taking you through the report and the findings. So I'm just going to do some technical bits where I share screen, so bear with me. Now I'm hoping that will work. Okay, can I just maybe ask one of my panel members to confirm if you can see that presentation?
Yes.
You can't, bear with me. Okay, so let's crack on. Okay, so the review that the Accord undertook was into the construction contract terms and conditions, as I said, which are used by government agencies. So we know that the terms which are used between sort of clients and suppliers continues to be a source of concern, and it's constant feedback that we've had since the construction accord was set up, that the lack of consistency and standardisation of terms and also the balance of risk transfer, they're sources of tension. So we decided that actually we needed to undertake the review to provide more of an evidential base in terms of actually what's going on. So there was lots of feedback and anecdotal feedback, but we wanted to actually understand what that meant for government agencies. And we wanted to share with those agencies the findings that we had, so that they could see where they sat in relation to those other organisations. Having worked in a ministry, the lack of knowledge sometimes in terms of actually what other agencies are using can impact in terms of the conditions and terms that you actually set for your own projects. And we also wanted to collate information on those special conditions which were used by agencies for the NZ 3910 agreement, and to feed this into the 3910 review process, so that the committee members who were working on the review process had that information to hand, so they knew what agencies were actually using and building into their agreements. Bear with me, I'm having some problems here. One moment. There we go. Okay, so the review process, what did it include? So we decided to contact a range of agencies so that we had a range of input from different types of organisations. So this was SOEs, local government and central government agencies, and it was for both 3910 but also CCCS, which is the conditions of contract for consulting services. So those agencies included the Accord agencies and those which had signed up to the Memorandum of Understanding, contributing to the review of 3910. We also looked at a cross-section of central and local agencies, so those larger regional agencies, but also the local agencies. And then we also had a look at GETS data, so that's the Government Electronic Tendering Services data, to see who had actually issued out tenders into the market in the last 12 to 18 months, so we could actually find out who was actually live in the market at the moment. So we asked agencies to respond to a survey, but we also asked them to provide us a copy of their standard special conditions so that we could assess their base and default position for contract agreements. So the responses, so we went out to 21 agencies and we got 18 back. So for 3910, 15 gave us copies of their special conditions, and the rest either didn't use them or don't use 3910 or didn't send us a copy. So there was a range of other agreements which were used, such as NEC or FIDIC, but the most common one that was used was absolutely 3910. So this kind of confirms that anecdotal evidence that 3910 for government agencies and government projects is still the standard agreement for main contractors. So for the review, and this was work that was actually undertaken by Carl Jackson. Carl, if you're online, thank you so much, because you spent a lot of time and effort doing this. Carl looked at over 1,800 special conditions, which sat across all of those agencies that responded. So that was a significant amount of special conditions that Carl trawled through in terms of his review. So well done, Carl. And for CCCS, we had 10 agencies respond. 3 of us said they either had no special conditions or used specifically the Crown core special conditions. So those are the all of government. For those of you that are not aware, government agreed a set of all of government special conditions to be used with CCCS. And there were a set of standard special conditions and a few, I think there was about 5 project-specific conditions that could be applied, relating to the complexity or the specifics of that project, normally more complex or more significant in value. So they're called the Crown Core or the Crown Project-specific conditions. So as I said, 3 either didn't use specials or use the core or Crown project specific conditions. 2 had no templates and just used the base CCCS, and 2 agencies had their own agreements in place. And 1 said that they used ASENs. So it's numbers, it's facts. I think we've got a lot of lawyers and engineers online who like detail. I just think it's useful to understand the context of who we were looking at. So the review process, how we actually undertook this was we looked at a risk-based assessment, and it was fairly crude. It wasn't, it was to give us a comparator. It wasn't, and we could have extended the scale and looked at the complexity or the level of risk, but we just wanted to get a feel in terms of the balance of risk and how that was applied. So we used an assessment from -3 to +3 to actually look at how that risk was applied in terms of balance of risk. So I won't talk you through it. You can see it on screen and you can see the factors we applied. But for example, if there was 10 special conditions and they all had moderate risk around a +2, then a score would be around 20. Now I'm telling you this because when we get to the next slide, I'm going to be showing you a graph. So those numbers in terms of the risk score and assessment, you'll then see that on the graph. So you can see how it then, when we reviewed agencies and assessed their risk position, we plotted them as an overall assessment in terms of where agencies sat. So let's move on to the findings now. I'm going to talk about the overall summary findings first, and then we'll look at some of the recommendations or key points that came through. So in terms of 3910, there was a range. What it showed us, there was a significant range of special conditions that were being used by agencies, both in terms of the number, but also in terms of the level of risk. And the chart, it may be, hopefully it's showing through, but this is the number of clauses, and this is the level of risk allocation along the bottom chart. And we've grouped the agencies there. So there was a range of specials. So the lowest number of specials was 7 for one agency. The highest was 310, and the average was about 130. And what we found, so we weren't counting clause by clause. A clause may have had several bullet points, but we classed that as one, not as if it had 7 bullet points. We only counted the major clause. Or should I say Carl did. Thanks, Carl. So group A had the least and lowest level of transfer, and they represented what would be classed as the best practice procuring agencies, but they normally had, they were normally those larger infrastructure agencies with lots of projects and lots of volume of work. Group B in the middle here were more complicated contracts, and the risk wasn't too far outside of the norm for the rest of the sector. And Group C had higher risk, more complicated contracts, and would be seen as a significant level of risk transfer in terms of feedback from the sector. In terms of findings, so I won't go through this. We actually looked at in too much detail. We looked at what was agency specific conditions. So those might be in terms of security checks or specific sensitive requirements that an agency might want to include, or a project specific sort of terms, which might be a building specification or something that would be in the scope. So we could see what was specials in terms of towards those general conditions, and then those which are slight differences in terms of the project or agency. Okay, CCCS, again, same with process we took for 3910. Again, a range of special conditions used and a variance in terms of how those were applied. Again, just repeating there some of the numbers that I talked about previously. I can't actually see the chat function, Jen, as we're going through, so I'll take any questions at the end, but if people are putting in questions as we go, I'm not looking at it because I'm presenting, so I'm not ignoring you if anybody's putting questions in. But we'll come back to those later.
I've got it, Alison.
Thanks, Jen. In terms of CCCS, again, a very similar picture. And those agencies which were for 3910, very similar in terms of their position, in terms of risk and number of special conditions. So a strong correlation between both sets of agreements. So again, level of risk and number of clauses. So in terms of findings for CCCS, agencies generally were incorporating where they were using the all of government specials. they were generally including the project-specific conditions in for every project or every agreement, rather than as advised for those one-off, more complex projects where they may be needed. And then there was also a trend for those agencies to seek a higher transfer of risk to the consultant. So the effect on risk allocation to the consultant was higher, whereas those with fewer conditions, there was lower risk transfer. Okay, and then a similar position in terms of number of special conditions and where those were agency or project specific. So there was a strong correlation in terms of how agencies were using special conditions. So I've just talked you through kind of the process, the assessment, the findings in terms of number and risk. I won't take you through, I think I did this to one of Hannah's group for the ACE Legal Forum, and we went through some of the clauses. When I chopped my presentation down for today, I think I took out 50 or 60 pages of review of clauses and what those impacted. So I'm not going to take you through that today. What I will talk about, though, is some of the recommendations and the process we did as part of the review. So after we assessed sort of agencies' position, we did go back to them and showed them where they stood in terms of findings against other agencies. And we also looked at their for feedback on their rationale of why certain special conditions were being used, so that we can understand that before we formed our final view on our recommendations and suggestions back to the agencies. So we did that back in Q2 last year, and then we had the meeting and the feedback from agencies, and then we finalised our report to them in Q3. And I must say the agencies were really cooperative and really worked with us on this, and really did explain their rationale and why they were using certain clauses. And even though we were pushing them in terms of actually, is this appropriate, should it be used, they were really open to the feedback and suggestions that we put forward, and those which they felt were still needed, that you know, we had an open and clear conversation about their reasons or their rationale why. Some agencies have already started to implement some of the suggestions and feedback that we provided. Others have committed to the future to making amendments, but also, as I come to the recommendations, working together on a greater level of standardisation and consistency. Some agencies also thanked us, particularly because they'd never had that level of informational review. They'd had general feedback, but the assessment really helped them to understand their position as well. So thank you to all the agencies, and I see that some of them had registered today. So thanks for your input and your cooperation in terms of taking part in that review. It's been really helpful. So in terms of the findings, so as I said, it did highlight the agencies were amending the standard agreements through special conditions, and there was a significant variation in a significant number of them. So it was showing that there was limited standardization or consistency through their approach. And agencies are delivering sort of construction projects, and what we found is those with fewer special conditions and a more reasonable allocation of risk are also viewed by the sector as those with as being better practice or better clients. So I think there's a correlation between risk and contracts, level and scale of project delivery. So some of the recommendations, and these are in the report. I won't read through them all. I'll probably just touch on the headings. So if you've read the report, these aren't the only recommendations we gave out to agencies, but they were the sort of core 5 ones that we identified. So making sure that special conditions were best for project outcomes. This is quite a general statement, but the feedback that we gave to individual agencies that we felt that it didn't necessarily drive productive behaviours or lead to a relationship through the agreement to drive best practice, productivity and project outcomes. So that was something that we fed back in terms of some of those individual special conditions and some of the behaviours or level of risk transfer or insurance or liabilities kind of implications. Time bars was the next one. So time bars we felt weren't necessarily being used fairly in terms of claims from contractors and consultants. So we provided some feedback around time bars and how they should be used. Intellectual property was another area. The intellectual property and ownership of intellectual property seemed to be a standard clause, which was in all special conditions across agencies, not all agencies, in a number of agencies, and we felt that it wasn't necessarily for all projects and contracts that IP needed to be owned, particularly in consultancy services. And that's why the all of government project specific ones have an IP clause for ownership rather than joint IP. There were a number of operation, legislative and technical matters included as special conditions. So health and safety, RMA were just two examples, but there were a range of other operational matters that we felt were better placed in specifications or scope of services than the actual general conditions. And that would help to significantly reduce the number, but also lead to a greater level of standardisation and consistency. And then termination for convenience was the last one. I'm just looking at my time, and I'm probably going to run over, but I'm going to chuck through these because I think these next few slides are important. So on the back of the findings, the Accord agencies met towards the end of last year, and they, as a result of the review, they've committed to a greater level of standardisation and consistency across the special conditions. And they're looking to cooperate and come together to review the all of government special conditions for CCCS and to update a revised version sort of towards midpoint of this year. And then when the 3910 new agreement is released towards the end of this year, they'll then create all of government special conditions for 3910, because there is some acceptance that above, although we're having a new agreement, 3910, and this will resolve some of the special conditions that agencies currently use, it will mean that there will still need to be a set that are specific only for government agencies over and above the standard, but we'll agree a common set of those. And then we're also working in the meantime to seek agencies to review their special conditions and move to a standardised approach whilst we're undertaking that work. And just a point, because this was a question that came through, we will be working with industry bodies as we work through that process and agreeing the revised all of government for CCCS, but also the 3910 specials as well. And last slide for me, because I want to give the panel members a chance to speak. Benefits, obvious maybe, but yep, more efficient procurement process, so less negotiation. Sorry for the lawyers on the call. Less legal costs. There'll be, and hopefully less legal costs in disputes as well. Sorry, Michael, if you're on. Yeah, it should be lead to less legal costs all around. Clarity of ownership on risk, and that it's with the party best able to manage it, improve relationships and increase productivity of projects. So that's me sort of signing off on those benefits, and I'm going to stop sharing there. And there we go. So this is my that's the end of my presentation and my quick whistle top tour of the review. Sorry, I'm just closing down, and I think this is now my opportunity to open up to the panel members. So Blake, you're first off. So Blake, you're the General Manager Infrastructure Delivery at Waihanga, or the Infrastructure Commission, as some may know them by. So Blake, can you tell us from your perspective then, what some of the impacts that special conditions have on the sector and to the delivery of infrastructure projects.
Thanks, Alison, and thank you to the Accord for carrying out this bit of work. I think we've had these conversations for a long time as an industry around kind of the frustrations with special conditions, and I mean that's kind of stating the obvious when we've got almost 300 people turning up to a webinar on this topic. It's pretty clear that this is a issue of kind of acute concern for the industry, and there's a lot of frustration. I think that's very evident in the way in which government departments have approached some of their contracts in the past, which is really making developing those good relationships that are really essential for the delivery of infrastructure really hard. So, that certainly is very evident here today. I think what the report's done a great job of is, I guess, mapping out that there are a few different issues going on here, and I think each of them have quite different impacts on the industry. So I guess when I picked up this report, there were three things that I took away. I think firstly, the thing that was a concern to me was the spectrum of approaches across the Crown. To see such a different, I guess, level and scale of contract conditions means that we really aren't using 3910 as a standard form, that we are creating lots and lots of bespoke contracts. And I think that's a real problem for us as an industry. I think it's driving a siloed approach to infrastructure. It's making it really hard to transfer lessons from one part of the sector to another because we're getting these individual areas of special practice, which is a bit of a concern. Right now, I look at some of the infrastructure challenges that we have ahead of us. We're predicting at the Infrastructure Commission that our pipeline of projects could grow by as much as $140 billion over the next 30 years. And that's going to have huge capacity constraints on us and as an industry. We really need to make sure that we're creating good career paths, that people can move around the industry to where they're needed most. And also that we're getting the best out of all of our people. That to me is one of the big concerns here, is how can we create efficiency if we really are doing things differently time and time again. I think the second thing that jumped out at me were some of these really extreme numbers of special conditions. And it's great to see that that's not universal and is only in a handful of places. But that indicates to me that actually if we're making that many changes to a contract, we're obviously trying to do something quite different with this contract than was originally intended. And I think that's one of the things we're really interested in at the Infrastructure Commission, and be keen to talk to the industry about is this showing that we perhaps might be overusing 3910, and that actually there might be different types of contracts that we need to use in different situations that are perhaps better suited to the complexity or size of some of the projects that we're trying to carry out, and would allow us to take a more standardised approach without having to try and heavily modify a base agreement that was trying to do something different. I think the final thing that jumps out at me, and then I'm really interested to hear reflections from the other panel, so I will stop talking, I promise, Alison, before I run out of time, I guess is around the risk transfer and some of the analysis there. I come from a legal background, I have a commercial background. I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't insist on robust contracts. Currently we spend about 5.5% of gross domestic product on public infrastructure. That's kind of $1 out of every 20 gets spent through the sector. So we should have robust contracts. We should be insisting that we get really good value from that public spending. But I'm not convinced at all that all of these clauses and all of those risk transfers are working towards that outcome. And I think that's the approach we have to see going forward. If we're going to decarbonise our industry, grow this industry, make it an attractive and productive place to work, then we're going to have to develop contracts that focus on those outcomes and don't just focus on minimising and transferring risk. So that's where I think the greatest opportunity is for growth. And if we can develop contracts collectively that achieve those outcomes, then I think we're all going to be much better off as an industry.
Thanks, Blake. and I think I talked more than you. So, but you were well on time, and yeah, and some good observations from you there in terms of the impacts. So I think I will now hand over to Hannah Bryce, and Hannah's the chair of the ACE Legal Roundtable, and she's also general counsel for NZAP GHC. Hopefully, I said that right, Hannah.
You have. Thanks, Alison. So I am very lucky to have the pleasure of chairing the ACE Legal Roundtable, which is a collection of all of the in-house lawyers from New Zealand consulting engineering industry. We get together quite regularly, talk about what we're seeing in the industry, things like that. And Alison came and presented to us recently on this report, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about our perspective on it. I think firstly, the thing that we would like to celebrate the move away from GMC Form 2 towards CCCS. The report was quite clear that the old GMC Form 2 terms are no longer being used widespread, which is fantastic. CCCS brings a much more balanced risk portfolio, which we think is great. In terms of the large number of special conditions, I think I'm probably echoing both yourself, Alison, and Blake, that we don't think that it's best for project or best for productivity. Generally, what our engineers and designers and consultants want to do is to deliver the best possible work for their clients. And if the lawyers spend a long time at the front end going through the terms and conditions and negotiating, it's not going to allow us to bring a timely response to it. Especially, if we think about what's happened in the last couple of weeks with the destruction through the North Island, I know that ACE has reached out along with NZIA, NZQS, and Survey and Spatial to the construction sector called Ministers to offer their services for quick remediation post Cyclone Gabrielle and how we can support in that area. And if we get stuck with the lawyers in a room negotiating those terms and conditions for weeks on end, it's not going to help our population recover from this. I think the other point is around the administration of the contracts. We can spend a lot of time working on the terms and conditions and looking at them on paper, but actually a lot of special terms and conditions make the contract quite difficult to administer. And as you said, Alison, we do end up in disputes because things are not normal and we might miss certain time reporting, invoicing requirements because we've got these special terms and conditions in there. In terms of how it's impacting consultants, we're seeing lots of amendments around those limits of liability, indemnities, transfer of risk. And I think we can all agree that generally the mandate is that the person who controls the risk is best placed to manage the risk. But we're seeing a lot of push in the terms and conditions to move that, to move the risk holding away from the person who's controlling it. That makes it really difficult to get insurance. It's already a tightening insurance market. And what we don't want is to end up with a whole bunch of consultants or architects providing services to clients that essentially are uninsured. Because if good times go bad and we have to call on insurance in that scenario, it's not going to be best for the client or best for project in the event that there isn't insurance backing us up. I think that there's probably quite a few points that we'll pick on through the rest of the chat, but one of the really interesting things that we see is the differential between the types of clients amending. So the larger, more sophisticated clients making the fewer amendments than some of the other clients using these terms and conditions. So I think that will be one of the points we'll come to later on, but that's kind of how it's impacting the consulting industry at the moment.
Thanks, Hannah. And you're right, we've got some great questions to get onto, so we'll see what comes up in the chat later. So finally, lucky last, Jonny. So Jonny Eames is the National Commercial Manager at Naylor Love. So Jonny, can you give us your perspective from Naylor Love, but also maybe from sort of the broader your colleagues in the sector in terms of the contractors and the impact that special conditions have on you and them?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks, Alison. Thanks for the Accord for this opportunity. Kind of echo what Blake said. It's great to see the Accord you know, trying to make a difference in this space. From a contractor's point of view, it's pretty hard to see the negatives of what this report has found. And as you say, there's kind of two views. I want to touch on the Naylor Love view, which, you know, we're getting close to a $1 billion year turnover, but also the industry-wide review of you know, of the contractor fraternity, I suppose. So from our point of view, it was, I actually went to my colleague, group risk manager, who spends most of his time looking at these clauses and special conditions, and he actually came back and said to me, this is a terrible idea because I'll be out of a job, which I think raises quite a good point, and I'll work to reassure Justin that he still has a job if we see this come to fruition. But you know, from the industry-wide point of view, you know, I forget what the stats are, but, you know, 90% of, something like 90% of New Zealand contractors, you know, have less than 10 employees. So, you know, whilst we're big and we can handle it, we have the resource, you know, as the industry as a whole, and the construction industry and contractors, you know, they don't necessarily have that dedicated resource. So we need to look at it through that lens as well, and churning through all these clauses makes it very hard. So I guess you know, segue into that, you know, the impact, Alison, that you asked about our perspective of special conditions. You know, we probably work on the basis that roughly 35 pages of special conditions is somewhat manageable, somewhat average. I know you've referred to them as clauses, but you know, we kind of count in pages, which can get up to 50, 60, 70 pages of just, you know, Schedule 2 special condition changes. You know, and finding, you know, the 310 of the upper number, it's significant. And again, saying what Blake said, we're no longer using 3910 as a base document. And you know, the impact is simply, as the report finds, it's time and money, which is resource. And you know, you have a lot at tender time when you've, you know, say we only win 1 and 3, but we're reviewing every one of those special conditions, you know, for every tender we do nationally. So you know, you got to ask, how can the smaller you know, contractors actually deal with that at tender time, and how do they do the resources? So you know, this approach will certainly benefit that side of it. But then I guess on the positive, you know, then the report references this, is that established agencies, some of the established agencies are more, you know, they've kind of got standard conditions, and I will call out the Ministry of Education. You know, they're quite sophisticated, they do a lot more of the work, but you know, they have standard terms that we blanketly agree to, and that makes it a lot simpler. We still have quite a long duration of maybe technical clauses or clarifications to make, but we do. But you know, it shows that it can work. And I think, Hannah, you mentioned it too, is the administration of the contract through the project lifecycle. If there's different rules on every contract, that makes it very hard to get those consistencies. And I guess just Alison, reflecting on what I found from the report, and as I've kind of touched on it, you know, we support it, we agree with it. You know, we see the significant differences between the agencies that we work with and the sheer number. And there's one part in the report that I did find quite interesting, which was a quote around there was little correlation between the scale and complexity of a typical project by an agency and the risk transferred and retained through special conditions. So to me, that kind of implies that there's been little kind of thought process about really assessing the risk. You know, we do have an example from an agency where the, you know, 130-page contract of changes, there's no difference between a $5 million project and a $130 million project. So getting consistency and assessing the risk in the right way. And again, you know, how do the smaller contractors deal with that? And it kind of sometimes it feels like, and it'd be good to get that consistency, because it's, you know, are we just having a risk transfer creativity exercise? Is sometimes what it feels like when we're not actually really dealing with the real issues. So, and some of the other points, I won't go too long, it's probably my time's getting close to, but you know, the removal of time bars, which ties into the collaboration versus mistrust. Look, I think think that's good to remove that, but I don't think it's a complete blanket approach of removing time bars. There still need to be mechanisms, which the report refers to as, what is best for project. And the big question there is, why should someone get something for free, and what other industries drive that sort of behaviour of putting risk in there, or hiding risk, or creating these time bars so you run out of time. But as I said, you've got to look at that from a client's perspective as well. It's not healthy, for at the end of the project just to have an increased cost of the project or time. So support that, but there does need to be a collaborative mechanism, which a collaborative approach. Can we look at other contracts, NEC type contracts, where they have more early warnings, a bit more collaborative approach where you're sitting around and you're kind of working on it together and understanding the risks. Look, you've kind of touched on the other things. Termination for convenience, I think, is a really good step forward, especially because the impact on contractors if the jobs were to stop, that comes back to resources. If you've allocated your resource to a project and then it can just be terminated, you've turned down other work. So the impact of that is really significant. A few other reduce the clauses relating to the operation technical matters. You're right, scope of works, document specifications, put it where it needs to be. And yeah, I think that's positive. But I guess in summary, not many negatives to it. Certainly, there are benefits to that consistent approach. Significant time and cost savings on internal and external resource, greater contractual awareness, again, going back to Hannah's point, would probably have a better chance of administrating these projects correctly. If we look at the figures, 20% of all contracts run through these agencies. So if we've got that consistency, I think it would be really good. And I probably would like to, from a contractor's point of view, collaboration versus that culture of mistrust. Probably take it back to the KISS theory. We've got to keep it simple, stupid. Simple language. Don't be afraid to talk about risk. These contracts should be robust, but don't be afraid to talk about it, and let's not have risk by stealth. So all in all, I think it's positive from a contracting side. I'll leave it at that, and
Yep.
And I'll
thanks,
hand you
Jonny.
back, Alison.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I liked sort of your sort of closing statement about sort of that collaboration and working together, because that's what we want to do, is deliver the project and not argue over the terms or have disputes along the way. So on that point though, so we're now going to move to some questions, and I can see one's come through on the chat, but I'm going to start with one that came through prior to the session, and I'm going to open this all up to all of you. So I think from each of you, what's your number one top priority in terms of special conditions that you would like to be addressed? So if you had to pick one, and rather than give you a number, maybe I'll give you two. What's your top two priorities? And I'll maybe start with you, Blake, in terms of if you think there's a real opportunity to make some changes, where would the focus be?
I mean, I think the number one focus is we'd like to see greater consistency across agencies. We have seen some real positive work from some of the agencies to engage very effectively with the market around fit for purpose clauses. We need to get better at picking up that great work and sharing it around and getting more collective buy-in to it across Crown, because it does take a lot of time and energy to work through these things and develop a really good contract. So let's not do it time and time again. Let's all get together as delivery agencies, do it once and do it really, really well.
Okay, thanks, Blake. Jonny, Hannah, have you got any different views or a different something else that you would pick on as a number one priority?
I think I would kind of build on Blake's one to say that early engagement with the industry bodies, there's so many industry bodies who are keen to help negotiate these from the outset, make sure that they are appropriate, especially if clients are using external law firms to assist with those special terms and conditions. Generally, those firms won't be privy to the commitments of fair and reasonable contract terms that the Accord agencies have made. So working with the industry bodies at that time can help keep everybody on track in terms of that.
Okay. Jonny, different view from you at all? We've lost Jonny. I'll maybe move on to another question.
Sorry, Alison, I was on mute. Classic. So no, it's definitely the consistency and just identifying the risk. Let's not do risk by stealth. Let's talk about it. Let's put it on the table. Let's see who's best to deal with it, and have robust discussions around it, and make sure it's visible and it's sitting in the right place.
Okay, thanks. Now, we did have a question through, and we had one prior to the session starting as well, and I think you mentioned it, Jonny, and like you talked about other contract forms as well. So what do you think because we have 3910, which is used as the standard, but NEC, FIDIC, there may be other special conditions out there. I suppose, Jonny and Blake, what's your view in terms of should we be moving to those contracts? I think, Jonny, you've already said there's an opportunity to look at what the approach of NEC and the more, the advanced warning, the collaboration, etc. Do you think we should move to NEC, or do you think we should? Is it regardless of the contract, it's the behaviours?
Yeah, I think it's the behaviours. I think 3910 can do it, and I think if we just bring in some of that language, and NEC, I've spent some time in the UK and know of it. It's just the way you work with it. It's more collaborative. It's more getting around the table. It's identifying the early warning. And I noticed in a chat there saying there's already advanced notifications under 521. Absolutely, there is, but there's just more mechanisms to it. But it is administrative heavy. So, it actually needs more resources itself during the project, but it's about identifying, the early warnings and actually coming together to find a way to mitigate it, and rather than going ahead and doing something that you shouldn't be doing. So I think we can take learnings, but I would trust that the review would hopefully be able to bring some of those learnings in and adapt it to 3910.
Thanks, Jonny. Blake, I know that Waihanga are looking at sort of contract form and agreements used, and there's a piece of work you're looking at now. Have you got anything in terms of your views on other agreements and maybe where the market should be moving?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I'd say is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to these things. I guess the way I think about it is I think that, form should follow function. The idea of the contractual framework is it's meant to document and capture the working relationships and, how we want to interact between clients, consultants and contractors on a project. And I think that's the thing we really need to think hard about, is what is the team and what are the working relationships that we're trying to establish to solve the complex problem that is any infrastructure project. And I think the type of relationship, the type of working environment you need is quite different on perhaps a smaller civil job than it's going to be on a hospital or a light rail project or something like that. So that to me would be the most important thing. We need to think through what is the type of delivery relationship that's best going to enable success on a project. And then we should be finding a contract form that allows us to document that easily and efficiently. And I think if we took that approach, we might see that for certain types of projects, there are other types of contractual relationships that better match what we're trying to achieve. And I think we should be open to using them as an industry where they're appropriate.
Okay, thanks, Blake. Now, we had a question that came through prior to the session about all of government terms and conditions, so CCCS, and if we're going to look to create some for 3910 as well. The question was, should we be mandating the use of all of government special conditions? So, Hannah, maybe I'll start with you, and then maybe get Jonny's view after.
Sure. I think that while in theory it might seem nice that we could have one size fits all, like Leigh said earlier, one size really doesn't fit all. So we do need to be mindful of that. I think probably mandating base terms and conditions with realistic movements from those would be helpful for the industry, especially if the industry has helped create them.
Thanks. Jonny?
Yeah, probably not too much more to add to that. Yeah, it's obvious one size does not fit all, but there must be a way to standardize, a majority of what has changed, because some of the changes are so minor. It's just wording, but the implications can be quite significant. So yeah, a bit more consistency where we can, but then identify it, and where it needs to be a bit more bespoke. There's one place we go to see where it's bespoke to address the different agencies or the different project or the different risk or profile of the project.
And that was definitely a conversation that happened with accord agencies, that that they will have some things which are needed for their organisation or their type of project. But yes, having a kind of a standard position and common wording for those clauses, because in the review we found that a particular clause might have multiple different wordings, but generally the same principle. But you can imagine assessing that and reviewing that. So I definitely agree, having a base position and some additional ones which might be agency specific, but a general approach is used, or those general special conditions is used, is what we're aiming for, is what we're looking to do, and to agree with those accord agencies first, but then to flow that down through the rest of the public sector. So just having a look at the chat function. Just a quick reminder, if we don't get to your questions, either the ones that have already been asked or online, we will make sure we try and answer them. So there's a question here. We've noted an increase in special conditions requiring novation to the contractor. Will the construction accord be looking at this and providing guidance to the industry? So in terms of novation, it's not something that we've specifically noted. We noted the clauses in there for the review. Generally, I think for the CCCS, all of government agreement, there's already a novation, a clause which talks about novation of the consultant under a design and build contract. So there is already something which is as for novation in CCCS, all of government terms. I would imagine that if we would relook at that as part of the review. I think another question that we had in was around sustainability and also broader outcomes, which is a similar theme. So there was a question saying, were these clauses, did we find these clauses as part of the review? So we did find that some agencies were including them now as part of their special conditions. So in terms of delivery of broader outcomes or ethical practices in terms of subcontractors and employment agreements, and also with regards to carbon and other sustainability clauses. So they are starting to appear in the standard templates. So we did see them. Will they form part of the special conditions going forward? I think that's to be confirmed once we actually look at the review. I can say, because I sit on the 3910 review committee, that for the general agreement, it was a discussion by the review committee in terms of what should or should be in there, and so that it has been considered as part of the review committee as well. Just scrolling down, other questions. I'm going back up to see, what will this review do to prevent head contractors creating and adding their own special conditions to a contract, i.e. just de-risking their contract by adding perceived risks to subcontractors? So this is the supply chain issue. So there may be a level of risk transfer between client and main contractor, but it doesn't actually then flow through. And by the sounds of it, sounds that there's greater risk transfer down to subcontractors. Jonny, unfortunately, I'm going to pick on you and ask for your view on this one.
Well, we use the Royal Master Builders subcontract, so that head contract does flow down through there. So what we have with the head contract should flow straight down through to the supply chain. So
yeah,
from our perspective, unless it's grossly changed or adapted to the subcontractor, but it shouldn't be. Those terms should flow through. Okay. So it's fair all the way through.
Okay. So just seeing, we just got a couple of minutes left, maybe time for one more question. See, I can see, Paul, that you said it's likely that the CCNZ subcontract will do the same as the master builders one. One last question. I think we might just touch on insurance. In terms of, there was a question, how many conditions in the contracts are uninsurable? And Hannah, you talked about the impact of insurance, or the ability to get insurance for some of the conditions that you see coming through for consultants. As there many areas, or is there areas where insurance is now becoming harder to get? Is that change? Are those trends changing?
Yeah, it is changing. I think there's probably two questions there. One is what's happening with the insurance market, and we could have a whole chat on that, but we don't want to make people's eyes glaze just right now. But generally, when global financial crises come on and the market tightens, insurance is going to be harder to place. Insurers get it cagey, they will ask more questions, they'll do more due diligence to try and figure out whether they want to take the risk on the particular company project. What we're seeing also is a push for consultants to take on additional risk that they're not controlling. So agreeing to unlimited liabilities, agreeing to periods of liability that are not defined, taking on greater duties of care, having to increase their QA to deliver to gold-plated standards under the contract. And that may not be insured under their current policies. They may have to go through their policies with their broker and increase, or they may need to look for project-specific insurance, which I'm not sure if anyone has tried to place recently, but is incredibly difficult and time-consuming. So I guess those are the concerns, that the base policies are not covering the increase in standard of care that clients are requesting. And if consultants try and increase it, it's one, going to increase costs and clients are going to have to pay for that. And two, it's going to, again, slow the whole process down.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. And that was quite a short summary for insurance, so well done. And on that point, I am going to call the question and answer session piece to the end, because we've just got a few seconds left. So for those of you that we haven't answered your questions, either those submitted prior or online, we will get back to you with a response. And I'd just like to say thank you to the panel members for taking part today, and thank you everybody for joining us, and take care. Thanks. See you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.